Welcome, everybody. Welcome to the Farm Human Resources and Employee Management webinar series. Today's webinar is all about employment insurance. My name is Kelly Henwood, and I'm the WSU Extension Regional Small Farms Program Coordinator. I work in Clallam, Jefferson, and Kitsap counties. Thanks to grant funding from the USDA Rural Business Development Program, this free webinar series is part one of ongoing educational webinars and workshop opportunities all about farm human resources and employee management. The target audience for this webinar series are farmers who have not yet or are just beginning to hire farm labor or employees. So a little bit of Zoom housekeeping for everybody. This webinar is being recorded and will be available for viewing afterwards on our Small Farms YouTube channel, as well as our WSU Extension online learning library. We are creating a list of links and clickable resources that will accompany this webinar and will be emailed to registrants after the series is completed, as well as available on our website. An evaluation will also be emailed to everybody after the series, and we'd love to hear your feedback. So please keep an eye out for that evaluation. Since these webinars are grant funded, it's important to show the impact of these educational opportunities to our funders, as well as provide us feedback. If anyone has a question at any point during the webinar, there's a Q&A function on your Zoom toolbar. Please feel free to click that Q&A button and type in your question at any time, and myself or our moderator, Mark, will be monitoring the Q&A. So who are we today? Myself, Kelly Henwood. I'll let Mark introduce himself as well as some of our guest speakers that we'll have during our panel today. Mark, do you want to take it away?
Sure, thank you. Thank you, Kelly. So welcome, my name is Mark Bowman. I'm the Sustainable Agricultural Coordinator for North Olympic Development Council. And my role this year is to work with farmers in Clallam and Jefferson County, helping them overcome issues to growth. So whether you're expanding in a new product line or just trying to become more efficient or whatever it is, if there's hurdles that you have to growth, I'd love to meet with you and sit down and just start working through this year, helping you overcome those hurdles. And this program is free to you, the farmers. It works on the timeline, works on your timeline. And so in addition to that one-on-one service is we have this series of classes that we provide to you as through the Washington State University Rural Business Development Grant. And one of this is this series here. And so today we're going to talk about a topic under human resources that really doesn't get enough attention, and I've even found this out myself as being a farmer, and that is having the proper insurance in place for covering your employees. And with us today, we have three speakers. We have Paul Ely of Country Financial Insurance, and we also have Shanna Lee Phillips and Heather Hardman of Insurance Services Group out of Sequim. And so I'm going to start with Paul. Paul, if you give us take some time and opportunity to talk about yourself, your insurance services, and especially some of the work you do with farmers in your region.
Yeah, so I'm Paul Ely, live here in Chehalis, Washington, and been with Country Financial Insurance for about 26 years now. Our company, we're affiliated with the Washington Farm Bureau, so we do kind of work hand in hand with memberships and some of the benefits and services that they offer for farmers, as well as, you know, we're on their website as a benefit of Farm Bureau and vice versa. We do home and auto insurance also. We offer associate memberships for just home and auto policies. We have full voting memberships with the Farm Bureau for farm policies. We do retirement services, mutual funds, business insurance, do some limited commercial on things, and life insurance and retirement planning. So kind of a full spectrum insurance. We're just kind of along the same lines as we're a direct writer, so we're not an independent. So everything that I am able to offer has to be through Country Financial Insurance. Some things we can broker through, like Foremost Insurance, if we need to do mobile home policies or other things like that. But for the most part, farming was our specialty. Our company was created back in the 1920s, and we're actually right across the street from State Farm in Bloomington, Illinois, because two guys didn't get along, and he said, well, I'll start my own company. And we went across the street and started Country Financial. So I think that's probably pretty good background. Like I said, 26 years with the company, and we have quite a few different farm exposures that we're able to do. I have a lot of vegetable farms. We have fish farm hatcheries. I have a couple buffalo ranches, emu farms. There's quite a variety, as well as the dairy farms and the cattle farms and hay farms. So quite a spectrum there. So I guess that's a synopsis.
You've got the Chehalis well covered then.
Yeah, Chehalis well covered.
Good. Well, Shanna Lee and Heather, tell us a little bit about yourselves, your operation here in Sequim, and some of the coverages that you provide.
Thank you. My name's Shanna Lee. This is Heather. I have 30 years experience in insurance. Insurance Services Group is an independent agent, and so we write with a wide variety of carriers. Some of the key ones for farm insurance that we use are Liberty Mutual. We do Mutual of Enumclaw, Grange, Oregon Mutual. We also write with commercial markets. We do personal insurance, so we are well-rounded as far as the different aspects that may come up on a farm, whether it be the personal home insurance, coverage for employees, when the farms get bigger and they need commercial liability or property coverage. We have a lot of options to, take care of people. Heather primarily does a lot of personal line insurance, but she's doing the farm insurance now also. So she's relatively new to the farm market, but she's doing a great job. In addition, we are able to write like employment practices liability. That'll come up later, I'm assuming, in the course of this discussion. So the agency itself, I'm located in Sequim. We have offices in Port Townsend, Port Hadlock, and Mount Vernon and Edmonds and Everett. So we're pretty well established in the Western Washington area. We also are licensed in other states to write insurance. That doesn't help our small little guys in Washington and Colma and Jefferson County, but we do have that ability. You want to add anything, Heather? Or are you being shy today?
I'm being shy today, but I too do have 30 years experience in the insurance industry, but more so on the personal side.
All right, very good, thank you. So actually, Shanna Lee, since you're all warmed up, ready to go talking, just as a broad spectrum, first of all, what are some of the insurance requirements for covering employees? We'll get into more specifics in a bit, but just, the broad brush stroke first of what are some of the requirements?
So broad stroke on this, Washington State is one of 4 states in the nation where Washington State controls your workers' compensation. Other states, you would purchase a true workers' compensation policy. So as far as covering employees on a farm, there is not a specific coverage that most Washington State farms need. You are going to want to purchase a coverage called stopgap liability. That's Part B of workers' compensation, so that if you create an unsafe work environment, you can be sued by your employees for that. There's also coverage that a business owner can purchase as employment practices liability. That's your sexual harassment, your wrongful termination. If you are a large farm and you're offering benefits to your farm workers, there's coverage that you can purchase because you're managing are taking care of that money for them. So you could have a liability exposure there. Obviously, you do need to be concerned if they're driving your vehicles or things like that would come into play. But typically on the farm owners and in Washington, there's not a lot of specific coverage to purchase directly for an employee. It's more how your farm operations are, what they entail, what type of farming you're doing, what exposures they might have as far as, working with your animals, if they're working with the produce, things like that.
Okay, good, thank you. So Paul, anything you want to follow up to that you see that is important, that your broad brush stroke when you're talking with your clients?
Yeah, I think that on, I mean, that was a great explanation for Washington and what we have to deal with, because I think we're considered a monopolistic state. But on our farm policies, that's exactly that. We add stopgap liability, or we call it employer's liability, when it shows up on the policy. But a lot of ours, we just figure out man days labor for what the charge would be. So however many employees you have, how many days per year you think they might work. I just did a larger vegetable farm last year, and basically their cutoff is they have over 5,000 man days labor, which is the highest charge. And then it kind of goes down from there. And it's exactly it for the stopgap. If all of a sudden someone was running a tractor and got injured or hurt or anything like that, the state L&I would come in, but then say that person lost an arm or something and is no longer to work, then the family might turn around and try to sue the employer or the farm for that. And that's where a stopgap liability can step in. Usually there isn't requirements necessarily for employees coming in to add them to fall in under the liability, but we just usually recommend some proactiveness where it's like, hey, if any employees are going to be running equipment or running vehicles or running errands, that we could gather their information and run driver's license MVRs for them, with the consent of the employee, just kind of to know if, hey, do you have a employee with a bunch of DWIs or a lot of speeding tickets, and maybe at that point you're kind of like, yeah, maybe you don't need to run the errands to town. We'll have someone else. It's just kind of being a little proactive, but there isn't mandatory requirements.
Well, that's actually good to know, and thank you for bringing that up for both of you. So so insurance agents can actually be a little proactive in helping employees think about who does what activities based on some of the information you can gather. Is that basically what you're saying?
Yes. Yeah, and actually with Washington Farm Bureau, they have retro safety programs based on the size of the farm or the commercial program that you can actually pay, and they'll it's like for a smaller farm or so, it's like $100 a year for the premium, but they'll actually come out to your farm and they'll go through safety programs and put on a little class, and they'll answer questions or different things. And on the email I'd sent you, that has that attachment in there, and it's called their TLC program. So that's kind of where we work hand in hand on Farm Bureau for safety. And one of their big philosophies is just the proactiveness and being aware of having good safety programs on your farm to prevent future losses. And, just instead of having an employee come and, hey, go do this, maybe run through some expectations and things on the farm and point out where the first aid kits are and everything else to prevent future losses or liability.
Okay, that's good. So Kelly will provide that link as part of the links when this Zoom is done and after the series is done next week. As Kelly had mentioned at the beginning, this recorded video and all the attached links will be sent out to everybody that's been participating in this. So that will be one of the links that Kelly will provide to folks. So that's good to know. All right, Shanley, I'm going to turn it back over to you for a moment, and I'm going to ask you, when you sit down with employers, farmers, and value-added processors, I'm going to throw them into here because a lot of the farmers we work with do a lot of value-added processing and actually do a lot of marketing of their own products and such. So when you sit down with the employers, agricultural employers, um, what's the employee information that you want to know, that you want to receive from these employers?
So when I'm doing an initial account, I will ask our company's rate based either on the number of employees. A few of the carriers rate based on employee payroll. If you have the vehicle exposure, we are going to need, their names, their dates of birth, their driver's licenses. As Paul explained to you, want to check, typically in hiring practices, you're wanting to ask for a copy of their driving abstract or the driving record, or at least ask what is on their record. That makes my job easier. Companies that I work with typically don't run their motor vehicle records until we submit the account. They based on what information we're providing to them. And several of our carriers do have resources to help, as Paul was explaining too, with being proactive as far as doing some management of your business and safety programs. We write with so many carriers that each of their programs vary. But initial information for gathering for employees is relatively simple in the farm market. Like I said, they're looking for a number of employees, maybe the payroll, and then that personal information on them.
Okay. Paul, anything else you want to follow up with that on information that insurance agents require from the employers?
No, generally that probably about covers it, because like we said, when a lot of the employees are hired, I mean, most of it's kind of proactive, because the liability is really going to kind of fall. I mean, you could hire someone today, put them on a combine and send them out somewhere, and they cause damage or an injury. I mean, they're going to be covered. It's so that's where kind of having the, like I mentioned, the safety programs and kind of proactive and kind of maybe being a little involved with your employee a little bit could help prevent some big future losses.
So let me just ask, I'm going to ask Paul, I'm going to follow up with the next question, because you just started to delve into that. What do the insurance agents need to know about activities that the employees will be engaged in? And with that, tell me a little bit about what you want to see regarding employee manuals, handbooks or manuals. Anything along that line in addition to the activities?
Well, I think with the employee manuals, again, that's part of the proactive, the farmer. I do believe like the retro safety program, that's part of some recommendations and having those. But on the farm, a lot of it, I mean, we're our main point for putting liability together for farmers or business owners would be, figuring out what their assets and net worth would be to establish a proper liability limits. I mean, someone could be worth $500,000 or $10 million, and it's part of our job is to establish what's going to protect them properly, whether we do a $1 million liability on their farm and throw on a $5 million umbrella. Some of that could be based on the type of farming they do, type of exposures. Just a regular cattle farm is less liability than it would be a dairy farm. So, I mean, there's added exposures. And so depending on the number of employees, what the exposure is, we want to make sure we have the proper liability put in force for the farmer that's going to adequately protect them in case of a large loss or something, because it's more of not having that financial devastation because of not having the proper liability limits or not being aware of it. A lot of people don't realize that you can have higher liability limits than what's offered on the base policy. So it's just kind of more of education and letting the farmer choose, giving them options of what's going to fit their needs best.
Okay. So Shanley, along that same lines, let's just say it's a vegetable or a orchard type operation, and then you also have another one that is, let's say, livestock operation. What are some of the questions you're asking to learn more about the activities and maybe a little bit of the risk associated with one of those type of operations versus the other? What are some of the key questions you're asking?
Okay, so in relation to employees, there's really no additional questions we ask because you need to contact Department of Labor and Industries for your workers' compensation. But as far as covering the farm in a whole situation, what we like to know is what type of farming operation. So as you address whether or not maybe they're a fruit or orchard versus an animal operation, they would also want to know what type of products you're doing. So some of the differences as the farms grow larger, if you are selling raw product, like you're only selling the fruits and vegetables, or maybe you're selling those animals live on hoof, you have your farm liability that takes care of that. When they expand and maybe you're selling in the meat industry, wrapped meat, or if you're changing your product, let's say you're making applesauce out of your fruit or jams, you need to have a second component for commercial liability. So we'll ask those type of questions to determine, what your liability needs are. And as Paul expanded on, making sure, what their assets are to determine what liability they may need. Also need to know, if they're selling directly wholesale, if they're doing farm, going to the farmers markets, if they need additional coverage. A lot of those markets they go to want additional insured status. Sometimes those vendors, if you're selling products that will be going into a grocery store, need to have that product liability. So we are having that discussion just to see what the operations are. We'll expand and ask about gross sales. And what those annual receipts are will impact what their premium is. We'll also be talking about equipment and property coverages. So whether they have, the big combines and need coverage for that mobile equipment, if they've got the barns where they're keeping animals or their store, a storage facility. We need to know, what the operations involve. So they can be, depending on the size of the farm, quite a few questions and additional information we need. Sometimes we do the little small hobby farmers that only, are renting a field. They don't have big buildings, so they might not require as much additional information as a larger farm operation.
Okay, good, thank you. So Paul, back to you, and I'm going to back up a moment, and this is a question that's come in that Kelly fielded here. The stopgap insurance, and what about the other issues related with stopgap insurance, like sexual assault or some of the other activities like that, that we're seeing more prevalent and having to deal with, and is more in the forefront regarding stopgap and some of the other insurances to help cover some of those sort of things that occur.
I believe on Shannon Lee could probably expand on for the commercial policies. We're talking about you're able to add some endorsements to cover sexual issues on things like that. I do believe the stopgap would probably cover some of that underneath the farm policy for an endorsement on base policies, because commercial can end up being a separate beast a little bit. Different guidelines and things, but the stopgap would kind of cover a lot of the issues where families or someone coming personally after the farmer that would step outside of that LNI coverage through the state, since we are that monopolistic state with the coverage.
Okay. So what I'm hearing is there are various endorsements that can be attached to policies to cover certain coverages for certain activities or certain things that occur.
Just like Shannon Lee expanded on, lots of questions to ask for a first-time meeting with a farmer. On our policies, we have a lot of endorsements that we can actually expand out on until they reach, basically our kind of cutoff is if someone's exceeding 100,000 in receipts, and we kind of have to step into commercial general liability policies. But we have endorsements for what we consider roadside stands, or we can add on farmers markets. We can add room and boarding. If someone's renting out a room in their house or running a little bed and breakfast like thing, we can actually add a lot of endorsements to our farm policies. We have a couple, like I insure Buffalo Ranch, and they actually cut and wrap their own meat and they sell it off of the farm. And we actually have an endorsement we can put on there for some retail sales for the amount that they're selling. And also putting a coverage on, like if they're go on vacation and they come back and the refrigeration unit had went out and all their meat had spoiled, we can actually put some coverage on there to provide the meat that they're retail selling. But again, once they start exceeding a certain amount of money, then we have to step into general liability policies. And just like Shanley also mentioned, there's the wholesale sales, gross sales, and then going into retail. And then there is this percentage that we're able to do. And once say the retail sales exceeds a certain amount, then we have to go into a piggyback a general liability policy on top of it.
So Shanley, a question I wanted to bring up with you, because I know I've dealt with this a number of times, and it may be a little different and a less of an issue for produce that's being grown on certain properties, because properties don't change as quickly. But on livestock operations, especially when you pick up a lease here or pick up a lease there or drop a lease or move animals back and forth, various property sites. So when if you own a piece of property and then you lease several parcels, and then partway through the year you pick up a lease, and then you may drop a lease here. Tell me a little bit, tell our viewers a little bit about what you need to know with various property sites, and that can be a little fluid. So tell us a little bit about that.
So it's not uncommon for farmers to be leasing land that they don't own, in addition to operating their farms on owned property. So most policies, and I'm sure Paul's company does the same thing, will ask, where you're farming, want to know the number of acres. Quite frequently, if you are leasing land from somebody else, they want to be named as an additional insured on a policy. So we'll need to know about your lease requirements. And then some farmers have to insure when they lease land, maybe they're responsible for insuring property, like a barn or other structures. That's not uncommon. So we do have the ability to do things like that. We do need to know what the land's being used for. So again, that goes back to what type of farm operation, if you're growing crops on those lands, or if you're just having animals on the land, we need to know that information. And so it's relatively easy. Like I said, usually I ask the customer when I'm doing that initial review of what their farming operations are, I'll ask, if they're specifically leasing land or if they own what land they're using. And then I just want to elaborate real quick on the one question about the sexual harassment and those type of things. What they want to ask their agent for is an employment practices liability policy. Sometimes it's shortened to be an EPLI. And so some companies can add that by endorsement. Some companies or agents need to write a separate policy for that. So
okay,
just wanted to throw that name in so they had it in their repertoire.
Okay. And with leasing of land, and I know I do this, I will pick up a lease. I have a meat goat operation, so have goats grazing at different properties and doing different things. And but it's not difficult. And as we found out, it's very easy to, at a certain point of the year, I can come in and say to you, hey, I'm leasing this property. This is how many acres is, this is where it's located. This is the owner, list them as an additional insured for coverage. And it's very inexpensive, really, to add a piece of property. And it's not something that has to be done at the beginning of each policy. We can do this throughout the year, adding pieces, dropping pieces. So it's not hard, is it?
No.
Okay. And the other thing I like about this, and this may be good for the listeners too, is that I always find it that the landowner finds it reassuring when you actually are proactive and say to them, hey, on a part of leasing your property, I want to list you as an additional insured on the parcel. And that really provides some, that shows them that you're serious about it. You're taking good care, you're thinking proactively, you're covering them. And I find it to be a great bit of information to helping secure leases when you can be proactive and say, I'll list you as an additional insured on the property to cover you. And I think in my experience, I find that goes a long ways for coverage, and it's not expensive at all. So Paul, anything follow up on that you want to
Yeah, I
give?
was gonna add, so um, for leases or adding the additional insured, some farmers might just ask for a certificate of insurance, which is basically just, hey, yeah, you're covered, I'm good. But exactly like Shanley said, the best thing, and I always recommend to any of my clients that's leasing out or leasing, is to list that additional insured, because you have like with an additional insured, it provides like a roadblock of liability for that person, because when you list that farmer down with the field that you're leasing from, you guys will actually he'll share your liability limits until they're used up. And then once those are used up, then his policy will respond. For just a certificate of insurance, you're relying on, you could basically be brought into a lawsuit along with the farmer that's leasing your fields, because maybe your fences weren't maintained, and the leasee and the farmer maybe didn't come to an agreement of who was maintaining fences or other things like that. So the additional insured is just one other thing of, hey, let's just use all of your liability limits before I have to use mine, just in case. And it is inexpensive to add an additional insured, and it's just exactly like Shanley said, you're being proactive and asking the questions and giving that comfort to the client that, hey, you're doing the right thing. Or it might help get that farm lease where other people maybe just said, hey, can I lease your farm, and not mention, hey, we'll also put you down as an additional insured so you don't have to worry about the liability.
Yeah. I find it a really nice, I find it a really nice mitigation against that risk point for very little money. So I think I find it to be very helpful.
And you can list 10, 15 locations down wherever they're at. I mean, it's even if you don't list additional insureds down, there's no added cost to do that. And a lot of it, the farm liability does come in with the number of acres that you have. So if you're only doing 100 acres, the price would be X amount of dollars. But if you're doing 500 acres, you're going to have a little higher liability charge, but you're going to be well covered.
Okay, Paul, we'll stick with you for a moment here. And employees operating equipment or driving vehicles. And there's obviously the difference also between on-farm driving of vehicles. But, again, as we just talked about, if you have leased acres and you have to transport equipment, you're driving equipment from field to field using public roads, or vehicles from field to field, or you're delivering product, you have an employee that's delivering product to stores, or going to the farmer's market for you, or doing different things, or getting supplies. Talk to us a little bit about operating equipment and vehicles off-road and on-road. What do you want to know?
Well, I think we kind of touched on that at the beginning about running the motor vehicle reports on those employees, because that's really the only way you know what their experience is until you actually see them get behind the wheel and go. But coming up, there is no mandatory requirements under the insurance, and that's where that would kind of fall back on the farmer to have a good safety program to properly train on running the equipment, make sure they know what they're doing, based on where they're traveling or what they're doing exactly. I think really the only thing you can kind of fall back on is having maybe a conversation with them, having their motor vehicle report run, and make sure you have a good little training safety program to make sure they really understand how to operate that equipment. I mean, because you can't take for granted that everybody knows everything that you might think is simple. I was dealing with a farm where they had a 14-year-old son on the property, but they hired a farmhand, and he was told to go mow the lawn, and he actually had to ask the 14-year-old how to start up the riding lawnmower. He didn't know how to start up the riding lawnmower. All he's ever done was a push mower. So basically taking for granted that someone would know something that you think is just common knowledge, the 14-year-old had to teach this grown adult how to run a riding lawnmower. So, I mean, it's baby steps sometimes. So, but yeah, I think that expands enough.
Okay. Shanley, anything else you want to add to that?
No, I think Paul hit it on the head. Really, in Washington State, that employee getting hurt is going to be on the workers' compensation policy with, labor and industries. But the standard farm liability, if they're taking that farm equipment from one field to the other, that's going to be on the farm policy for the farm liability. Obviously, if they're driving a vehicle, that's going to be the auto portion on a policy. Sometimes your employee might use their personal vehicle, instead of a farm-owned vehicle. So on the auto policies, and I'm sure Paul's company does the same thing, you can purchase a coverage called non-owned auto. And so typically we do hired and non-owned, so that if the farm is named in a lawsuit because that employee was using his personal vehicle on a farm errand, obviously the insurance follows the vehicle, so that employee's insurance is going to come into play if he actually causes bodily injury or property damage to somebody. However, the farm could be named in a suit, and that's why it's essential for them to have that non-owned auto liability coverage.
All right, so you just delved in partly into a question that I wrote down here later, and that goes a little bit about business structure. And you've just talked about a policy, an auto that may be owned by the individuals and not by the farming entity. And so talk to us, Shannon, start with a little bit about where assets lie and whether that's in the farming entity, whether that be an LLC or a corporation or wherever, versus personal, and some of what you've seen and why it may be important to have, especially vehicles or trailers or those sort of things fall under, if it is more important for them to be under the farming entity versus the personal, and how it can get a little muddy.
It can be made. So I'm going to start by saying, obviously, you should talk to a lawyer and your financial advisor.
There you go.
About that. But yes, when we're just, initially writing a farm for somebody, we need to know if the farm is a sole proprietorship, so if it's just operated by an individual, or like you said, an LLC, a corporation, because that is a separate entity. Quite often, I see farmers that may own property as an individual, but the farm itself is a separate entity. So we do need to know that when we are taking care of your farm, because you'd have to make sure each interest is covered. And my understanding, again, talk to your lawyer, the reason that farmers or any type of business forms those separate entities is to protect assets. And I know that can get a little, the waters can get a little bit muddy with the farmers, because so many of them do operate as a sole proprietor. So you are pulling personal assets into that exposure, as far as putting them at risk if you don't have high enough liability limits. And the purpose, it's usually easier to have vehicles registered to a separate entity to protect your personal assets. So there's a reason for doing that. And then you have to worry, like I said, about the non-owned or hired auto coverage, depending if you're going to rent a car too. That's a whole other aspect of this. But if you're an individual farmer and you have a separate corporation, but you're using your personal vehicle, you may have that insured on a personal auto policy. And if you don't have that non-owned auto liability on the farm policy, the farm could potentially have their assets at risk because you are doing business for the farm. So a lot of times farms do try to separate those and not use personal vehicles, not have employees using personal vehicles for doing, farm errands or any type of business activity.
Okay. So Paul, I'm going to have you follow up on that and talk a little bit more about what you've seen regarding separation of entities and the importance of it from your perspective.
Shannon Lee expanded really well. I mean, that kind of covers it, but yeah, with the non-owned auto is important, and most of it is you would really try as a farmer not to have your employees go use their own vehicles. I mean, typically with the farm, you're going to have a service truck or a runaround vehicle or something, and they just need to get from point A from home to work and point B home. But that non-owned auto coverage would basically take care of that. And I think on the separation, if we're talking liability or other things, that's exactly right back to what we had mentioned earlier, is if all of a sudden certain things start exceeding a certain value that they're bringing in money wise, that's when you start stepping into outside of the scope of a typical farm and into a commercial policy, where you would then need to step into a piggyback separate general liability policy. But
this also
Emily did
goes
great on the info. So
okay, and this also goes for trailers, flatbed trailers, livestock trailers, in addition to vehicles, as far as, you know, trying to keep them, if they're being used for business, try to keep them in the business entity, correct?
Yes.
yeah, with our farm policies, we're able to, because it's a farm, we're able to insure a lot of Freightliners and big heavy trucks and trailers, and for hauling chicken manure and hay and everything else outside of the scope of just a normal homeowner auto policy. So we have a pretty broad range of, as long as that vehicle or equipment is used for farming, we're fine with it on a farm policy. But if they start hiring out and doing work for others that's outside of the scope of the farm, then you do step into a commercial type trucking policy or something else. But we have a pretty broad range of big dump trucks and Freightliners and things that we're able to put under our basically farm auto policy instead of going to a commercial.
Okay. All right, Paul, I'm going to stick with you for a moment on this next one. These are two I've just added in, so, you know, this is going to be, you don't have notes on these two.
Just the mystery questions.
This is the mystery question. So Shanley gets some time to think about this.
Okay.
Two I've added in here. One is, now, again, our farmers are usually smaller here on the Olympic Peninsula, but you know, occasionally products could go to Canada, could go to Mexico. So talk a little bit about export insurance, and also maybe covering for organics, certified organic operations. Is there anything more need to know about those?
Well, for the organics, that doesn't step out of the liability spectrum.
Okay.
I mean, whether it's organics or not, I mean, the liability is still going to apply versus versus not. So some things on some of our dairy farms is we do have some crossover issues when they get into just doing like raw milk versus pasteurized on the dairy farms. We almost have to sometimes look at some different avenues. The same thing if they're making cheese and unpasteurized, and because part of the organics is people like buying the raw, just the pure raw milks, and that does kind of pose some liabilities on the farm. So we have to sometimes do different markets where for Shanley, I'm sure it's easier since she is an independent and have some other markets to go through. That's usually where we have to either refer out for that type of policy or just refer the whole account out if there's certain exposures that we're not able to do. And some of the farms nowadays also are starting to get in for making extra money of doing wedding venues on their farms.
Good. Yeah.
And then that steps into different liability limits based on what they're doing for the venues, because some of these old barns have these beautiful lofts up top and they're not being used for what they originally intended for. And so you're seeing a lot of these pop-up wedding venues coming up to make some extra money, which is a little down on assets with COVID, but I mean, hopefully that picks back up where more wedding venues are going again. But you know, a typical wedding venue can make $5,000 a day on leasing out their barns and facilities. So you do step into a different type of a liability. For traveling, I think for Canada, no issues there. We typically have a Canadian card that we can actually fill out for the clients, or they can get them just to kind of show proof that they have insurance to travel up into Canada. Mexico, I think a lot of the liability on the United States policies kind of cease, and sometimes you have to purchase, if you're taking your vehicle down into Mexico, you have to purchase some insurance down at the border, if I'm not mistaken.
So what I'm getting more at there is selling product to Canada or Mexico
Oh,
or
versus
overseas. Yeah. So product insurance coverage for selling product out of the country, whether it be a finished value-added product or a raw product, especially those who may live close to the Canadian border and selling berries and maybe some of the other things. Anything regarding export insurance?
Yeah, on that, I would have to like pull out a policy to refer to the wording and the language in the policy.
That's
and
why
that's
I was going to left
some
field
of that
question for you.
would because they do address outside of the US in policy. So it is going to be policy specific in the type that you would need to have. So for relaying out information on that right now,
no, that's why it was
100% confident. That's why I tried to direct it towards the wedding venues to make it sound like I knew what I was talking about.
All right, no, that's very good. But actually, you just opened up a question. I'm going to throw that one to Shanna Lee. Is people visiting the farm, agritourism, weddings, events? You start getting into things like alcohol coverage insurance for events and things like that. Can you talk a little bit about agritourism and people coming onto the farm and those sort of things?
Absolutely, happy to. And I'm just going to pop in on Paul because you really surprised us with that question of products going outside of the country. That wasn't fair, was it, Paul?
No.
But he's right. Refer to the policy. Typically, any suit has to be brought in the United States for that. So that if you do have farms that are doing things in other countries, that's something you want to talk to your agent out because it may require a separate policy. So anyway, on the agritourism, yes, we've got lots of farms that are expanding and doing this type of thing, whether it be the vacation rentals, having weddings on premise or other special events on premise. We're an independent agent, so some of my markets are allowing for that depending on what the attendance is. They do ask about the alcohol. Typically they want the whoever you're having to come on premise that's maybe going to have that wedding event, they're going to need a special event policy that names the farmer as an additional insured. If they're serving liquor, you're going to want to make sure they have liquor liability. And that you're named as an additional insured on that also, whether they're using a caterer that might have a liquor license. They may have to get a banquet liquor license, if they're just, serving maybe the wine for the toast or something like that. Those policies, of course, we do sell special event policies, but there's a lot of carriers that have those available online and they're relatively inexpensive, but that does change your premium as a farmer, and it does add an extra exposure. And so they'll be asking what your gross receipts are, making sure you're collecting certificates, being named as an additional insured. They also worry about safety issues. I've had a few farms that may have a creek too close to the barn, and then the underwriters get all concerned about, somebody falling into that pond and drowning. Where are the cars being parked? So that is something you want to be aware of. If that's something you're looking to do on your farm, is you have to look at it in a different way than you would a farming operation. Because they also, if you have animals close, we're going to go pet the animals, that causes a problem, so you kind of have to keep stupid people away from things that might be an added enticement that they would do something they normally wouldn't. So let's see, the vacation rentals are another thing that I'm sure Paul's seen too. They're renting either a room out in the house, or maybe they have that little, maybe it used to be a caretaker's cabin on the property, but now they're using it as a vacation rental. You need to talk to your agent about that, because that isn't a standard exposure that's going to be covered on a farm policy. And if you don't tell your agent about it, they can't make sure you have the proper coverage.
Okay. So no, don't go pet the buffalo, right?
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah, we do, to add on that, we actually have an endorsement on our farms called the Fall Festival endorsement, where if someone's doing pumpkin patches or basically whatever type, if they're doing some big events that maybe last just for 1 month or something, we can add on an endorsement for that. But if there's more things year round, not sure if you're like familiar in Olympia, they have that Latins cider farm that's there where they just basically have retail sales year round. I mean, that's, you know, and then, but each holiday, then they do like haunted houses and pumpkin patches and everything else. So you have a brief amount of farm exposure during that time, but throughout the whole year, you're basically talking a commercial exposure. So it does depend on what actually they decide to do and how they do it on their farm.
Okay, great. So we've got 9 minutes left. I'm going to save the biggest question for the end. So the second biggest question I have for each of you, and I'll start with you, Paul, is what have you seen from your 30 years of experience? You said 25?
26.
30, 26 years of experience.
I'm not 30.
Okay, so what have you seen as some of the high-risk labor activities around farming that you would just caution employers to just think about and just monitor with just a little more exposure to potential risk?
Typically, some of our highest claims or liability exposures that we've seen for farms is, you know, Christmas tree farms is one, because you have a lot of the employees, you know, a lot of them, you're having helicopters come in, pulling up bundles of trees, you're running saws and equipment. I mean, that's a high liability exposure type farm. Dairy farms are high because you're milking, you're around the cows, you're around manure, things are slick, you're running equipment. Horse operations are actually, we really have to kind of question what's happening on a horse farm. I mean, we can do boarding, we can do some operations that are on there, but when you get into training on the farm, you've got doing lessons going on, you have little shows going on. I mean, that really adds to an exposure. Lesser liability farms, you know, usually just cattle farms or vegetable farms are lower risk liability. But yeah, in general, for the 30 years, I think the ones I'd mentioned first seem to be the highest liability. And that's kind of where those safety programs really need to be brought up and proactive, make sure everyone knows how to fire up chainsaws and look out for the helicopter that's coming in with the hook to grab a bundle of trees to pull off. But yeah, just for the most part, I think in my experience is having a thorough conversation with the farmer. And basically, it's almost like a doctor's exam. Hey, tell us everything that's wrong, everything you want to fix, or what was the problem with your last doctor, or whatever the case is as a new patient. And you're going to be fine putting the proper coverages together if you're basically honest and straightforward with each other.
Okay. So Shanley, anything that you've seen, observations that you want to add to that?
You know, with the farm market, there's such a wide variety. And again, in Washington State, those employees getting hurt, you're going to be looking at what Labor and Industries and Workers' Compensation and your OSHA do as far as how you training. I think Paul hit it on the head. You got to make sure your employees are trained properly, that they're operating the equipment in a safe manner and know how to use it. There's just so many exposures because of the variety of farms. And I like what Paul said about, you know, you need to talk to your agent and be honest. I love Heather's famous line. What is your famous line to ask?
I'm your nosy neighbor.
I'm your nosy neighbor? Okay.
I like that.
Yeah. Yeah.
It's Alice.
Yeah. All right. Last question, a big one. And I'm going to give it a little context so people can understand. And I'll use my farm as an example. So we have a meat goat operation. So we do, we mostly sell, and we've made a conscious decision up front to do wholesale sales to restaurants and grocery stores. So that means we take our animals down to the Puget Sound processing for down in Centralia for USDA meat processing at the mobile slaughter unit. The product goes to Heritage Meats in Rochester for the cut and wrap facility. everything is USDA, and then we deliver product to grocery stores and restaurants. Okay, so with all of that, we are not just a farmer, but we are owning our chain of meat, cuts of meat through the whole process and delivering it to restaurants and grocery stores. And anytime you're selling product retail to individuals who to other individuals, it's got to be USDA certified. So with that in context, as I've learned through the process with Shanna Lee, is we're not only a farmer, a livestock farmer, but we're also a wholesaler. So Shanna Lee, start us off with this whole idea: when you stop becoming a farmer, when you start becoming a wholesaler, and it's not just meat, but with some of the other products, and break down some of the distinction for us and why this wholesaler's insurance is important and sort of who it covers.
So with the companies I write with, a standard farm policy covers your natural product. So if you're growing vegetables and you're selling those at a farmer's market, you're not altering them in any way. You're not making a salad mix. You're not making jams or salsas. If you've got animals, you're not selling the wrapped meat. They're looking to provide liability coverage for that raw product. Once you alter it in any way, so if you're butchering the animals, if you're making it into another product, we have a lot of lavender farms in Sequim, so they're doing the distilled oils, they're making soaps, they're making lotions. You have a product liability exposure. And so that typically will require a separate commercial liability policy, so that you have coverage for that product that you're selling, whether it be wholesale, or we have some that sell it directly to the consumers, whether that be via a farmer's market, or they have a product in the store. You know, it could be the grocery store, it could be a gift shop if they're doing soaps. So it really, you need to make sure you're explaining your entire farming operation to your agent so they make sure that you do not have a gap in coverage.
Okay. So yeah, just the product line from very beginning to very end, how it, if it is processed, how it's processed, the end markets, users. So just that you can have a complete picture of the throughput of animals from beginning to end, or product, whatever it is, from beginning to end, so that the proper coverage is in place for you. Okay,
Yes.
Paul, anything else you want to add to that you can think of?
Exactly that. I mean, there is that crossover where once, you know, like you said, if you're raising berries and all of a sudden you start making jams, like Shanna Lee said, it crosses into altered product that can change the liability exposure, because now instead of just someone having a you-pick berry farm, you're now doing you-pick plus you're selling jam or something on there, and then that crosses in. On our policies, we do allow for a limited amount of altered product where we can add an endorsement onto the policy. Usually that limit kind of goes up to like 25,000 max. And it's kind of, a lot of times farmers are looking at all kinds of options and things to do to make money nowadays. And so we kind of allow, it's almost like a little, hey, you can try this, see what happens. If you make it big, we need to switch your policy. If not, you know, we kind of have you covered for a limited amount. But we do have a endorsement. It's called the sales of product endorsement that we can put onto the farm that will give you a little bit of exposure. But if it really takes off and you're coming up with the brand new all cooking olive oil that everybody wants, we're going to have to go to a separate policy.
Okay. So one final thing, Paul, since you're closer to Oregon, insurances, they run pretty much the same in Oregon as far as you know?
Pretty much the same. I'm licensed in Washington and Oregon, and usually for Oregon on farm policies, there's really no difference. I have a lot of individuals that have some big cattle hay farms down in Oregon, like in Hermiston area. And then they also own their ranches Up here in Washington, there's really no difference on coverages and liability. Auto policies in Oregon do have some different coverages with the uninsured motorist property damage and different things. But for the most part, Oregon and Washington is very similar on the ISO guidelines and everything else.
Okay, great. Paul, any closing thoughts from you as we close this hour?
I guess just exactly what Shanley had mentioned. Or the nosy neighbor comment was great, but you just have to talk with your agent to explain what you're doing or what we're thinking about, or we're thinking of expanding this within a year or so. Just be open and talk. Don't be afraid. I realize with COVID, some things have changed, but don't be afraid to ask your agent, hey, can you just come out and see my operation and look things over? I can show you what we're talking about, where we want to expand, because there's just tons of new different things to do, just like the Airbnbs, the room and boarding, the bed and breakfasts. And most of the time, clients will start, and that's part of why we have that limited liability, but a lot of times clients will start things and not tell you to see if it works. And then all of a sudden you could run into a potential exclusion or something that's not covered. And they're like, well, we thought we told you, or, you get a lot of backtracking, but it's just being honest and letting them know, because we will let you know if it's covered or not covered. But for the most part, it's having a good conversation. The first meeting usually is the longest, and afterwards you're doing just little physicals, I guess, as we're doing, to make sure you're healthy and things are up to date.
Great. Shanley, any closing thoughts from you? And I think the only thing I'd add in there is, as a client, don't be scared to go in and talk about changes midstream. Just because your policy has a start date and an end date 1 year later, you can always make changes midstream, right?
Absolutely. We're here all year long, not just when your policy's renewing, but we want, I think Paul hit it on the head as far as talk to your agent. Don't be afraid. Don't pretend you're going to try something and then ask later. We want to have the conversation before you have a claim. We want to help you do the type of farming that is going to make you successful. So we're here to figure out and find a solution for you to make sure you don't have a gap in coverage. Your primary job is to operate your farm and make that successful. We want to make sure you have the liability coverage so that you do not, lose everything you've worked so hard for. So just talk to your agents, be honest with them. If you have an idea, even if you think it's crazy, have that discussion with your agent, pick up the phone, give them a call, have them come out if they need to.
Great. So Heather, Shanley, Paul, thank you so much for participating with us today. It's very informative and really an insurance coverage for employees.
Could you post your email address, Shanley, on the chat box?
My email address? Absolutely.
Yeah, could you post that on the chat box? I just posted mine.
Oh, you're gonna make me use this computer here, huh? Let's see.
And this will, all your information will also be on the follow-up that goes out to everybody too. So I'm going to turn it over to Kelly to finish it out here, give us some closing thoughts, and to close this down. So Kelly?
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark, and thanks, Paul and Shanley and Heather. We will, as Mark's mentioned, we will send out a follow-up resource list that will include everyone's contact information. So if you don't capture it today, don't worry about it. And I also put in the chat, if you wanted to go to our small farms extension website, we have an online learning page where this webinar recording and our previous webinar recordings will be posted. So keep an eye out for that. Again, if you don't capture it today, we'll be sending that out. And then just a quick plug for the final webinar that's occurring in this series is happening next Thursday, April 8th, the same time, 10 to 11 a.m. And it's all about the costs of farm labor. And we'll have staff from Washington Labor and Industries, as well as a knowledgeable accountant who works with farms. So we'll talk a lot about federal and state tax requirements for hiring labor, setting up new payroll services on your farm, some rules and regulations, and then we'll also explore providing benefits for your employees and a lot more. So stay tuned. You should be getting a registration reminder next week about that. So thank you.
All right.
All right, Mark, I'm gonna send you my email address because I hit the wrong button and
All right.
I can't
We'll
see
get it
Paul
posted.
anymore, so you can forward it to
All right.
Paul.
We'll get it. We'll get
Okay.
it all posted. All right.
I was just gonna email you a question, Shannon Lee. So
All
Sounds
right.
good. Thank you.
Thank you all.
it was
Thanks,
nice
everybody.
meeting you all.
Nice to meet you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.